What's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing well. I'm really excited about today's interview with Scott Brown, the dev chef. If you've been hanging out with me for a while, you know that 6 months ago, we brought Scott Brown out to tell us about what we should know about our processed foods. He has over 30 years of experience as a chef and as a food product project development manager, which means that this guy knows his food inside and out. And today we're going to tackle an interesting topic, which is, where's your protein coming from? And should it be coming from different sources that maybe you haven't even thought of? I don't want to give away the whole conversation here, but I will say that Scott gives us a few of his own personal recipes to help us get more protein in our diet in a way that tastes good, increases our metabolic output, and helps us with muscle recovery. In this show in particular, we speak specifically about a product, and the link is in the description in the show notes below, in case you're interested in picking that up for yourself for a discount. But by the end of this conversation, whether it's just a better post-workout recovery method for yourself, or some existential questions about what we should be feeding our kids, I know you'll walk away with something valuable. And speaking of that, if you missed last week's show, I highly encourage you to go check that out. We spoke with Benjamin McGuire about his experience in the Spartan race, and that conversation really hit home with me enough that I'm committed this year to running a Spartan race for myself. And if anyone wants to join me, here's an open invitation to you for the Spartan race in Dallas in October of 2019. Come hell or high water, I'll be there, my wife will be there, and our new baby Bennett will be there. And I already have a few soft confirmations from people who listen to the show who will be there as well. So if that's up your alley, I'd love to see you in Dallas in October of this year, so I can shake your hand, run some obstacles with you, get a little muddy, and maybe grab a bite to eat after. I lived in Dallas for about 4 years, and I know all the good breakfast places. But before I make myself hungry here talking about Dallas's French toast, I'll let you get a little hungry listening to Scott Brown and I talk about protein. Thanks so much for joining us on the show, and if I can be helpful to your goals in this new year, reach out at www.definingdadbod.com. Let's do it. What's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing well. I'm super excited today about my guest, Mr. Scott Brown. We're going to be talking about everything from protein with regard to recovering from marathons and bugs and how they could end up in your protein shake. Scott, how you doing today, brother?
I'm great, man. I'm great. It's a typical December morning here in Ontario, nice and cold and crisp, and just happy to be alive.
Right. The winter here is a party as well, which we'll talk about in a bit because we're going to talk about running, and I'm a big baby while running in the cold. That's for sure. If you guys want to get connected with Scott, you can catch him on Instagram at Harpo1264. You also catch him on Twitter at DevChef. That's DEVCHEF, and on Facebook at Scott Brown. Scott, I want everybody to understand a bit about where you come from so that they can really have a good grasp on why we're having this conversation today and why you're a guy worth listening to, not just because you're a cool dude, but because you have over 20 years of experience as a chef and as a processed food manager. And I don't even know the terminology that you would use to describe the very interesting career that you've had. So if you could give us just a couple minutes understanding of where you're coming from, and then also what your personal fitness journey has looked like, you know, some of the events that you're training for now and stuff, so that as we talk about protein sources, that our listeners really understand where you're coming from.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah.
I'm in my early 50s, just to give you a context. I started my career very young, actually. Like going to high school, started out working in an A&W fast food restaurant, and I quickly learned that I really loved food. So went to chef school and took the traditional route of learning how to cook, and did some apprenticeships in Europe, in Switzerland, in Italy, and then came back to Canada and spent about 15 years in the traditional hospitality industry, working in hotels and restaurants. And I finished my career actually on that side. I had a farm-to-table restaurant in Prince Edward Island, Canada, back in the late 90s when farm-to-table wasn't even really that popular. And so we had an organic farm, and we had a really diverse set of services where we did private dinners, we did catering, we sold products at farm markets. And from there, I fell into product development. I saw an ad in the paper one day for a product development chef, and I went in and had the interview and fell into this side of the industry. And that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. So started off as a product development chef, and then eventually worked my way up into the role of director of product development, where I had a team of food scientists and chefs working with me to develop seafood products specifically, is where I have been in the past 13 years with this last role. So developing seafood products, and in so doing that, of course, you get to see both sides of the industry, coming from the culinary side where you're cooking for people, and then going into the food production side where you're producing for mass amounts of people, and starting to understand the connection between the culinary side and the food science side. So it's been a very, very interesting journey seeing the broad scope of food and the scope of the different types of needs of people, from the restaurant consumer to the retail consumer in stores, and what people expect and what people's knowledge base is. And then sort of add the fitness piece into that. So it'll be 9 years on January 1st that I had an epiphany in my life that I just needed to get healthier. I really had some bad health habits, and I was overweight and smoking and drinking a lot. And I had an epiphany on New Year's Day 2010, and I started to run. And from that day on, my life took a really drastic change in a very positive direction, in that I embraced fitness, and fitness just added so much benefit to my life. Along with fitness, the gradual progression of getting really interested in nutrition and what nutrition could do for my performance. So it was just so complementary to what I was already doing in product development, because I was trying to also understand, how can I eat better to perform better, and how can I use my knowledge of the culinary side and the food science side to do that. So how can I make tasty food, but that also helps me perform better? So it's been a personal journey on that end to discover new types of foods, and then in turn eating them, and then going out and performing and seeing what the results of these new diet changes were. And so in 2012, I decided to stop eating meat for ethical reasons, for sustainable reasons. And also I learned it became for me, and keep in mind, Alex, I'm just speaking from my own perspective. I don't have any technical knowledge or data to back my thoughts up and theories. But what I do think about is how my changes affected my body and how I adapted and how I got to where I am today. So when I stopped eating meat, I quickly learned that, man, I felt better. I felt more energetic. And over time, I made the theory that I think I just don't digest meat very well, because I felt lighter, I was running faster. And so I kept eating fish, but I just slowly started adapting more of a plant-based diet. And then fast forward to today, I know we're going to be talking a little bit about crickets later, and I started to play around with crickets 2 years ago. And then I've been doing that for the last couple of years. So when we get to that part of the discussion, I can maybe zero in a little bit more on why I like bugs.
Dude, I love that. First of all, I love your background, because I don't know anybody, and it could be just my limited life experience perhaps, but I don't know anybody who has lived on the chef side of the food table and on the product development side of the food table as long as you have. To me, that's just a powerful and beautiful thing. And then the fact that you are also an athlete. You just finished a marathon, 4 weeks ago? You crushed it. You're an athlete as well. So you're putting together all these things that just you can't find anywhere else. So if you guys want to hit this guy up, I'm not saying he knows everything. I'm saying he's a very, very interesting cat to talk to. That's why I'm bringing him to you today. But I wanted to make a note about our previous conversation, just understanding what this looks like. And so we were talking about food processes and how food processes or processed food is demonized in the fitness industry as a horrible thing. You'll hear a trainer say, don't eat processed foods, which is a really ironic statement when holding a protein shake in one hand, because, well, what processes brought brought protein to be able to create a shake that tastes like chocolate. There's processes that go from the milk all the way down to isolating the whey and putting it into water in a way that would allow it to mix without chunks. And you and I both remember 20 years ago, protein supplements tasting like chalk that had giant clumps in it and stuff. There's an amazing amount of food science that goes into being able to drink a protein shake, which is ironic when somebody would say, well, don't eat processed food while I drink my protein shake. Hey, so we had a great conversation, really opening my eyes and listeners' eyes. And if you guys didn't get to check that out, that was 6 months ago. Go find what you need to know about processed foods with Scott Brown. But that being said, I want to shift our conversation to protein specifically, not just about the history of the clumpiness of protein, which could be a fun conversation as well. But I wanted to talk today about protein sources, because in the fitness world, protein is an important topic. And if you don't know anything else, you do know that you're being marketed to regularly about what kinds of proteins you should be eating or whatnot. Just walk down the grocery aisle and you can see just about everything out there is trying to say, hey, we have protein in this thing. And you flip over the box and see 4 grams for, 50 grams of carbohydrates because they added a little sprinkle of whey to it, right? Protein's important. Now, there is a grain of truth to the fact that protein's a very important part of your fitness journey. And just a brief overview for people, protein's very powerful and important for your body, just like fats and just like carbohydrates are. And when we talk about protein being good for you, what we're really talking about is the amino acids in protein. Protein, if you think of it as a long chain, you could think of a chain with a bunch of links in it. When you break down proteins in your body, you're taking out those individual links and then using them for things. And those individual links are called amino acids. We can use amino acids to build tissues. We can use amino acids to create enzymes that allow different reactions in our body to happen. When we say protein raises your metabolism, for instance, we're feeding those reactions the enzymes that they need in order to go at a faster rate. And protein also generally requires a lot more energy from your body to process. So if you're eating a bunch of Skittles versus some bacon, which I know Scott's not eating bacon, but the point is, if you're eating a bunch of Skittles, it doesn't take much energy for your body to turn them into their constituent parts to use them for energy. Bacon, on the other hand, takes a whole lot of energy from your body to break it down and then use it to build some cells and use it for energy. And there's a bunch of other things we can talk about with regard to protein. I'll have a show coming at you soon, but I want you to understand that protein's a huge part of the fitness journey. And so as Scott and I are talking about protein, I know that you've heard it. I know you've probably tried to get more protein in your diet. I know that you've probably done just about anything to add supplements and buying protein bars here and there. So I know you know it's important. And Scott, you have a very interesting journey with regard to protein. So as you started to get healthy in 2010 and you started running and whatnot, can you take us through that journey a little bit? Where did you start getting your protein from? When did it occur to you, hey, I should probably increase my protein intake? And then what brought you to start questioning the animal products or the meat products thing? I'd love to hear from your perspective.
First of all, Alex, thank you for the way that you talked about protein and the chains and using that kind of physical analogy of the links of a chain. I love that because it helps non-scientific people like me understand things better. So that's awesome. I love that. And that helped me, that type of analogy really helped me understand how I need to choose my proteins, because it needs to be a complete protein like you mentioned. And with certain plants, I wasn't getting that full protein profile. When I first learned about protein, I used to lift weights back when I was going to university, and I knew that I used to eat this 6 times a day because I was really trying to bulk up, and I had to eat, I think I was drinking like 6 or 8 eggs for breakfast and eating a can of tuna. And I remember back in those days, we actually used to measure how much protein we were getting to try to build up that bulk. So I had a little bit of a knowledge around that. And then so fast forwarding up to 2010, when I started to run, I started to read a lot about running recovery and how important it was after a hard workout to recover properly, and that balance of protein and carbs for your muscles to properly recover. So I started to learn, okay, after a run, I need so many grams of protein because of my body weight. So, and I was following the typical runner's world theories around that. And, they were saying like you should make sure you get a meal into you at least 30 to 45 minutes after a run. And so I found the best way to do that was I had formulated this shake with yogurt, protein powder, cocoa, peanut butter, and I just figured out that formula, and I figured out how many grams of protein were in it, that it was enough for me to recover properly. And that just kind of became my go-to piece. So that was my connection to protein with recovery. And then I started to learn about how much protein do I need in my diet on a regular basis. And there's so many different theories out there about the percentages. So there's the 60 carb, 30 protein, 10 fat. And then there's the 50 carb, 30 protein, 20 fat. And I'm reading all this stuff and I'm like, man, I can't keep up with all of this. I can't be measuring my food like this closely. So I'm just going to start going with my gut. And I know what foods have what amounts of protein. And I'm just going to try to incorporate it into my diet on a regular basis. So I started to do that and then just really paying attention to how I felt. And so there were certain times when I wasn't recovering as fast, and I would go back and I would look at what I ate and said, okay, you know what? On this day, I don't think I ate very much protein if I go back and look. So I started to just have to continue to pay more attention. And then in 2012, you mentioned, what were my reasons around protein choices and why did I stop eating meat? So I watched the documentary Cowspiracy on Netflix, and that really affected me. And I'm not the kind of guy that goes through tons and tons of documentaries because I know a lot of them have agendas to them, and you really have to watch them closely. But I do have a lot of respect for Leonardo DiCaprio. I think he's got credibility in the industry, and he just doesn't sign up for any cause without doing his research and his homework. So I thought there was a lot of weight to some of the theories that they were talking about. And one of the biggest ones was what the meat industry is doing to the environment, the amount of water that it's taking, and just the, the inefficiency. So, 7 kgs of wheat to get 1 kg of meat is just not efficient, not to mention the amount of water that it takes to grow that wheat. When I looked at the numbers, it was just astounding. So I said, I got to start doing something to contribute here. So I just started cutting back on meat. And then as I started cutting back on meat, I started to notice that I was feeling better. I was feeling lighter. And I think you touched on something earlier around the amount of energy that it takes to digest and metabolize protein. I quickly learned that for my body, it was taking a ton of energy to digest an 8-ounce prime rib, which I absolutely loved. I mean, I really loved my meat. I loved the taste. But I just noticed the next day, I felt like there was a bowling ball in my stomach. So as I continued to reduce the amount of meat that I was eating, I noticed I felt better and better. And then one day I just said, let's see if we can stop this. Because my wife and I looked at the animal welfare part of it and the whole factory farming piece. And we're big animal lovers. As I said, we've owned our own farm. I know what it's like to go out and kill your own chicken. And so I know what that experience is like. And I have a respect for animals. But when I started to think about the factory farms that I've been in over the past and the treatment and the whole ethical piece, that wasn't sitting right with me. So all these things started to come together and we just said, let's stop eating meat. So we did that. We continued to fish because obviously I'm working for a seafood company. So it's part of my
cut out your own product, man.
Yeah. So I continued to be a pescatarian and then just started eating a lot more plants. And I noticed I started feeling better and better and better. I'm still doing the recovery shakes after the long runs and the hard workouts, and I'm finding that's really working well for me. And so I continued down this path from, 2012 to 2016. And then in 2016, I discovered crickets. And I can't remember exactly where or when. Oh yeah, it was a friend of mine who was a personal trainer like yourself, Alex, and he discovered cricket protein and he was playing around with it and he sent me a bag of it and he asked me to play around with it and see what I could come up with. So I started to play with it and I started to incorporate it into my recovery drinks. Instead of the traditional protein powder, I started using the cricket protein powder.
When somebody like Scott says he's playing with something, it doesn't mean that he's literally sitting in his living room pouring it between his fingers. It means he's, if I'm understanding this right, he's got this cricket protein powder and he's trying different combinations of shakes. I know Scott actually bakes cookies with it, which is, you know, when you think of it from a product development standpoint, when you add a foreign ingredient to a cookie, it changes the way it does or doesn't crumble. It changes the way it cooks. It changes the way it crunches and all kinds of stuff. So when he says he's playing with it, he's playing with it very differently than your 3-year-old would play with cricket protein. Let's just make sure we're clear there. So 2 years ago, you got turned on to some cricket protein, and then I'm sorry, continue your story.
Yeah, no problem. It's important to clarify what playing with means in the chef's mind. Yeah, so I started to experiment with it in different recipes, and it was fun. And I just want to add, the cool thing about cutting meat out of my diet is it really helped me play a lot more with vegetables and plants, which actually made me a better chef. It really, really did, because I had all these colors and textures and different things to play with, or as opposed to meat. It was more challenging and much more gratifying. And then throw cricket powder into the mix, and it's got a very, very different profile and a lot of different characteristics when you start adding it to things. So it absorbs a lot of water, was one of the first things that I noticed right away. So if I started to incorporate cricket powder into baking, I either had to add a lot more moisture, a bit more fat, or not bake the product as long as it normally would. So I ended up coming up with this really cool, I call it a power cookie, and it's got no sugar in it. So what I did is I puree bananas, and then I take dates and I soak dates in hot water, and I add that to the pureed bananas, and I add a lot of dried fruit, cricket powder, nuts, and I just make this really nice dough mixture. I put a little bit of baking powder and baking soda in to give it some lightness and leavening, and I make this really great dough. It's all done in a blender, so it's super easy. I scoop that out on the baking pans into cookie sizes, and I do some into little bite sizes, and I bake that in the oven at 325 for about 12 to 15 minutes, so they're still soft. And so that's one of the things you have to do with cricket powder, is not fully cook it, otherwise it'll be pretty dry. And I freeze these things, and they're great recovery bars. They've also got some coconut oil in it, coconut powder, a little bit of wheat gluten. So there's a fair amount of protein in them, but they're delicious. They're great to take, if I'm in a hurry in the morning and I don't have time for breakfast, I eat one of these and I'm filled up.
Man. So can we get that recipe? Is that possible? Can I post that below the show today?
Absolutely.
Yes. So I want to talk about a few of the things that you brought up, and then I want to keep talking about crickets as cookies, because that's fantastic. But backing up a little bit, it resonates with my personal experience when I want to say it was about 8 years ago. I was with a dietitian, and I tried going vegan for like 2 months. And by vegan, I mean, for those of you who don't know the differentiation between vegan and vegetarian, you literally cut out all animal products, no dairy. You're not eating eggs, you're not eating fish, you're literally just plant-based. And I remember just feeling like garbage for 2 months. It was terrible. And for some people, that seems to work out very well. I lost about 5.5 pounds of muscle. My performance was terrible. I didn't feel good. I wasn't sleeping right. And so vegan just wasn't for me, right? And the reason I went through that was, one, I wanted to find what was best for me, but also I really wanted to understand the different diet types for my clients. So then I pendulumed to paleo. I'm sure you remember the paleo craze and all the people who were going like, cut out wheat and eat lots of meat, basically. And what was interesting about that is about halfway through my experience with paleo, I gained my muscle back, and that was good. I felt a little bit better. But what was really interesting for me about that is about halfway through my experience, I remember eating my breakfast, which was really hearty. It had, like a pork sausage, and it had eggs, and it had avocado on the side. And I finished that, but I was still a little hungry. So I incorporated a sprouted seed toast or something, that didn't have grains in it. And I remember looking at this and going, this breakfast costs $17. This is not sustainable. People cannot eat like this forever. not only for me, I was making decent money as a young man without a family, but at the same time, I'm like, this is not the answer for the world, man. This can't be the answer. So actually, that's when I started being interested in how much water went into producing a gram of protein and how much resource and carbon footprint and that kind of thing. Because when you equate it out, you pay for that, right? So what was really interesting for me when I discovered cricket protein was the idea that it takes 1,000 times less resources to create 1 gram of cricket protein versus 1 gram of a beef protein. And then you can compare it to things like chicken and fish and even legumes, right? So we have pea proteins now available, rice proteins that generally mix pretty well with water and milk, although they're a little chalky in my experience. But cricket protein's still using less resources because let's face it, insects are nothing but little machines that turn grass into protein and fiber, right? So in my world, in my experience with the sustainability of it, it was actually what opened me up to the idea of consuming a bug. And so for anybody who wants to see this, I actually recorded mine and Gabriel's first time trying cricket protein powder. So if you want to check that out, I'll stick that link below. It was a lot of fun to put a 3-year-old and say, hey, buddy, we're going to eat some bugs. And anyway, I'll let you watch it. So that being said, fast forward 2 years. So you had some experience recently with running your marathon, fueled by, I believe, cricket protein powder and some BCAAs. Can you tell me about your experience in recovery from that? Because I know that's different from previous marathons.
Yeah, this was a great learning experience, Alex. This last marathon that I ran, I did a 20-week program for that one. And what I did specifically, because I knew I was going to need more protein because I was training heavily. So I incorporated more cricket protein into my diet and branched chain amino acids 5 grams per day in my smoothies for that period of time. I was incorporating approximately 4 grams of cricket powder on the 6th day of training. And then on that recovery day, I boosted up to 8 grams. So those things, regular basis for those 20 weeks. And one of the key things that I noticed after this run is, well, 2 things. The actual marathon, typically when you hit the 20-mile mark, you hit the wall and it becomes very, very tough mentally. I didn't hit a bad wall this time. Mind you, I finished at 3:45. I was trying to get 3:44. So I was a minute over. But I consider it an extremely successful marathon because I didn't suck during the last 6 miles. Like, I'm so happy that my body didn't give out on me, because when your body starts to give out a bit, then the mind starts to go with it. And once the mind goes, it's tough to come back. And I didn't have to stop and walk. I smiled running across that finish line. And when I crossed the finish line, I didn't break down. I didn't have to go to the medical tent, and the rest of the day, I walked fine. I wasn't hobbling to dinner that night like a lot of the other guys were. And the next morning, I actually went for a 5K run the next morning. And so I'm just blown away at how well I recovered. Not just that, but how well I was recovering throughout the training. It was amazing, doing really long runs and the next day feeling pretty darn good. Like, yeah, a little bit stiff, but nowhere near as bad as the last marathon, which was 2 years previous. And keep in mind that I'm aging. I'm 53 right now. And so typically, I don't know if this is true or not, but they say, when you hit 50, it's harder to keep up your paces in running. So do I set scientifically, or do I know that it's a fact that those things contributed? No, but I do know that those are 2 very different things that I've done in the past.
I appreciate that. And I wasn't going to call you old, but I was going to highlight the fact that, hey man, 53 after 26.2 miles, that's a big deal to be able to recover well. My first marathon, and perhaps my only, because it's a strain on Ehlers-Danlos joints, to be honest. But I was 22, and it took me 5 days before I could jog again. It was just a terror. It hurt so bad. But that being said, I want to highlight that addition of cricket protein and BCAA. So again, Scott's saying, look, this is not scientific evidence that somehow cricket protein is better than any other protein, and that if you had BCAAs, you too at 53 can finish a marathon in 3:45. But the interesting thing to me about both of those additions is, one, there have been some studies done on cricket protein because of its interesting composition. There's 4 grams of fiber in a serving of cricket protein, so about 20 grams of protein per serving and 4 grams of fiber per serving, and that fiber comes from the chitin, chitin, which is part of, the bug's legs and the bug's wings. And if that kind of grosses you out, I'm just going to keep saying it until you get over it, all right? Because you don't even want to know where your beef protein's coming from. If that's gross to you. So when we're talking about that, there's a large natural fiber composition to cricket protein, and they've actually done a few interesting studies where they've compared cricket protein to other protein sources, specifically whey. And what they find is a significant decrease in what's called C-reactive protein in the bloodstream. And the C-reactive protein is the protein that signifies an inflammatory response. So in people speak, when you take cricket protein versus whey protein, and this study was relatively small, it was 220 participants, but it was double blind. They didn't know they were drinking crickets, which was kind of fun to tell them afterward. And this was a couple weeks later. But they found that there was a drop in C-reactive protein, the inflammatory protein. So again, in layman's terms, that means less inflammation following supplementation with cricket protein versus whey protein. And whey protein is the dairy-based protein that most people are consuming for cost reasons, and it's very, very accessible in the industry, very easy to get your hands on some whey protein. So I find that fascinating, first of all. And then second of all, just to talk a little bit more about BCAAs there, branch chain amino acids, there are 3 specific branch chain amino acids. They're called branch chains because the way they're put together, they actually branch where the nitrogen is in the compound itself, which is really important because many of our tissues, our ligaments, our tendons, our muscle fiber, or even our cartilage, require a lot of branches in the amino acids that make up those tissues. And so in theory and in practice, supplementation with branch chain amino acids has gone to show reduced delayed onset muscle soreness, reduce inflammatory response over time, and they've actually done muscle biopsies that show it helps the muscles recover and retain better through the actual activity itself, so they don't break down as much. So in my mind, again, it's not scientific evidence to say, hey, I felt better after my marathon doing these things from my training and then on race day, but there's some solid scientific reasons around why that might be for you. And then we joked when we first started talking that maybe you just have a gene that makes it so that you do really well with bug protein. Who knows? But it's pretty interesting case study there. What does your family / your wife think about eating bugs on a regular basis, Scott?
She loves it, Alex. She loves it. So, for the listeners at home, I'm going to show Alex a piece of this meat that we make from it. So this is the non-spicy one, and this is the spicy one. So she loves this stuff because back home on the Eastern Canada, there's this thing called a donair, and a donair is, so some places they call them gyros, Gyor. It's basically spiced meat that's on a spit, and they shave it off and they put it in pita bread with tomatoes and onions, and they make this really nice sauce with sweetened condensed milk and vinegar and garlic. And my wife loves that. And when we stopped eating meat, she's like, man, that's one of the things that I miss the most. So I figured out a way how to make that with cricket powder.
Dude.
The right level of spices. I put some wheat gluten in there, and I bake it in a loaf and slice it, and we fry it in a pan, and we make pizzas with it, and we wrap it up and do the actual donair. And She gets so excited with donair night at home. So
awesome.
That non-spicy one that I just showed you is for a friend of ours because she came over and she tried it and she's like, Scott, you got to make me some, but can you make it less spicy so I can share it with my 2-year-old son? So by osmosis, I'm getting other people to start eating crickets. But, when you put it in a form like that, people have no idea what they're eating. You can't taste it. And that's why I think there's something here. If people don't know what they're eating and they can't taste anything, and crickets don't have a lot of flavor. They have a bit of an earthiness, but there's nothing offensive or polarizing or off-putting by them whatsoever. And so I'm going to show you, this is a protein bite that I made. So I was making some date squares a couple of weeks ago and I screwed them up. I screw food up once in a while. I was trying to make the crust with just almonds and no butter, and I was using ground almonds, and it just didn't work. So I put it all in a bowl and I blended it all up, and I put some cricket powder in and some coconut and some dried fruit, and I rolled them into balls and rolled them in the hemp seeds, and out comes this delicious power bar that I serve to friends when they, or power bites that I serve to friends when they come over. And after they eat them, I say, by the way, there was some cricket powder in there. And they're like, wow, that was delicious.
I love that. That's so funny. First of all, isn't that the truth when you're cooking things? You know, I'm not a chef by any means. I can't claim it. But I do share the proclivity to jump in the kitchen and go, what can I make out of this stuff? As Scott would call it, I like to play around with my food, right? So many of the coolest things I've ever done have been completely on accident. Like, well, I was just doing this thing and, well, that's what we have. My wife will go, oh, we're going to call that Van Houten chicken because that's good. But I do want to, center on this idea of the disgust some people feel toward, well, the idea of eating bugs, right? And don't get me wrong, when we think bugs, there are some gross bugs in the world, right? Like there are like the flies that lay eggs in your trash and all kinds of weird stuff, which we're not talking about eating, by the way. I don't recommend that. But when we're talking about crickets, in your experience, Scott, how are some people getting over that? Is it just the trying it without knowing what you're eating and then finding out later? Or is it a conscious process? Is that something that you went through?
Yeah. So for me, I've got a really open mind when it comes to food. So it's never been an issue. I know the president of Entomo Farms, and I work with him, and I've talked to him quite a bit about it. And he said, one of the things I said was, Jared, I think you got to try to market this to children because children will have more of an open mind and they're going to be your future consumers. And he said, Scott, that's a great idea. But one of my biggest consumer groups are elderly people. And elderly people are using it because there's a lot of elderly people that have trouble chewing. They have trouble swallowing protein. And they're using this in liquids and puddings and in soft applications where they can get their protein. They have no problem knowing that it's crickets. I think it's just like anything else, Alex. If you think 20, 25 years ago, people were grossed out by sushi. They were grossed out by raw fish. They were grossed out by the seaweed. Look at sushi today, how freaking popular it is. It just takes time for people to adapt to a new idea. And so what we need to do is we need to get creative with it. Some chefs are being really, really bold and they're putting it out there, the cricket in its whole form.
Yeah, literally a whole cricket.
So there's this great Netflix series on now called The Final Plate, and it's chefs. It's a really good one. It's chefs who have to compete against each other. The first one that won was it was a cricket torte that was rolled in gold. That won the first show.
Wow.
As they were so bold and they did it in such a great application. So you got these people who are really being bold with it and showing it as is. And then you've got this whole application, what I do, where it's ground up and put into products. Mm-hmm. I think where it's ground up, it's an easier way to get those people who might be a little uneasy. If you show it to them in an application and just say, look, I just replaced flour with cricket powder. And the benefit for you is you're going to get a really nice amount of protein by eating this. And you're not going to taste it or detect it. Make it into something that's tasty, that's approachable, and that they will enjoy. I brought these bites to a workshop last week. There was about 14 people there, and that was my contribution. And we put it in the middle of the table, and I just said, guys, dig in, and I'll tell you what's in it afterwards. And actually, one person said, I bet you there's crickets in that. And I thought, oh God, now nobody's going to try it. But because it looked like a really approachable type of food, everybody tried it and everyone loved it.
Man, I appreciate you sharing that. My wife is one who can't get over the bug idea. In fact, I've joked about it in one of my videos, and I've got my son chasing around the house with a cricket chip. And he's like, it's just a cricket, Mom. And she's like, I can't do it. I don't want anything to do with it. And, he's 3. He thinks eating bugs is awesome. But on that note, what I thought was really interesting is that someone made a point really, really interestingly recently, which was, look, hey, if you can't get over this hump, fine, but don't disgust your kids about it. because they're the ones who are going to inherit the world that has come from so much inefficient meat consumption. And so they're the ones who are going to have to deal with the 1,000 gallons of water to 1 gallon of water problem with regard to grams of protein. And if it's not crickets, I'm not saying this is like the savior of the world. If it's not crickets, then it's going to be something else that they're going to have to be open-minded to with regard to making sure that they get their nutrition. Because the world's not getting any less populated, and we want to make sure that we feed everybody. So they're the ones who are going to inherit this problem. So if you're listening to this and you think it's a gross idea to eat bugs, then at least don't ruin your kids for the opportunity, because most kids would be really open to this, especially if they're coming in the form of Scott's fantastic cookies or his, what are you calling that block of cricket meat? Like, what are you calling that stuff? I love that.
Well, it's modeled after what we call donairs, D-O-N-A-I-R, and my wife and I are still trying to figure out a word for it. So I'll get back to you on that one once I've figured it out. But one other thing that I'd like to add, Alex, that I think is very interesting is last spring I was invited to a local cooking school, Niagara College here. The first year students were challenged to come up with products using Jared's cricket powder, and they had the folks from Entomo Farms come down. And so there was 14 students, and we went to every student's station and they presented their ideas to us. You would have been blown away at the things that these students came up with, all using cricket powder. There was things like cakes to delicious cupcakes. One woman from Africa, from Cameroon, where they eat bugs on a regular basis, she made this delicious pate, like a classical French pate that was just amazing. I was totally blown away by it. And I had a great conversation with her. She's like, I don't know what the big deal is about bugs. We eat them every day where I come from, and we don't even know that there's protein in them. Anyway, 14 great things that came out of that day from first year cooking students, all made with cricket protein that I'm sure anyone would love. They were all delicious.
I love that. I think we just need to hang out, Scott. Like, I think we're coming over for dinner is what I'm trying to tell you. And it's quite a drive. You guys are way up there compared to where we are here in Arkansas, but we would love it. My wife would probably have to, have some salmon or something. But anyway, pregnant ladies get what they want, so you don't push bugs at them. That's been my experience. I want to shift the conversation just a little bit. If you want to find out more about this cricket stuff, guys, the link to some cricket powder will be below of this show. We're going to put Scott's recipe below. I'm going to make sure that this video, if you're listening to the podcast, I'll put the video, or at least the cut of Scott showing us his protein balls and his cookies and his donair cricket meat. I'll put that on YouTube if you want to look at that and stuff. It looks good. There's nothing crazy weird about it at all. I just know that I want to come to Scott's house for dinner and see how all this chef stuff comes to fruition. Scott, can you tell us a little bit about how you're defining dad bod in 2019 as we wrap this conversation up?
Yeah, so I'm on an interesting journey in my life right now, Alex. I've just started my own consulting business as a result of having left my job in product development. So entering a really exciting part of the journey where I'm starting to define what I want to do through consulting. So it will involve, there'll be a food piece to it. There'll also be a coaching and facilitation piece. Through it, I'm engaged in appreciative inquiry training. There's also an innovation engineering and coaching piece. So that, and of course, what's most importantly and what drives all of that is my health. And my mental, physical, and spiritual health are all the drivers behind those things. So those continue to be the core of defining dad bod for me, is keeping that base foundation strong and healthy so that I can be at my best to do all of those other things. But health has got to come first.
Well said, Scott. That's awesome. And I'm so excited to see where you go in 2019, man. I know you have so much experience under your belt and so many things that you bring to the table Well, there's a lot of puns there as a chef, so I'm just gonna leave that for the dad jokes out in the world. But there's so many things that you bring to the table, and I can't wait to see what that brings for you in 2019. Keep us posted, and I'll make sure and post some of your delicious stuff below. Scott, thank you so much for jumping on the show and sharing your experience with us. Do you have any last words for our listeners before we call this a day?
Yeah, I guess the final word I would say, Alex, is the big meat companies out there have got their eyes on proteins. They've got their eyes on plant proteins, and they've got their eyes on crickets. Here in Canada, Maple Leaf Foods, which is our largest protein company, has invested in Entomo Farms, the cricket company. So that tells you something. If you look around the U.S., Tyson Foods has invested in Memphis Meats and a lot of the non-traditional proteins. So if these guys are doing it, you know it's coming down the pipeline. Alternative proteins are the future, whether we like it or not. So let's embrace it and make the most of it and do what's right for our kids and what's right for our future.
Well said, Scott. I appreciate that. If you guys want to connect with Scott, you can find him on Instagram at Harpo1264. You can also find him on Twitter at DevChef and Facebook at Scott Brown. Until next time, guys, kick butt, take names.